So Jesus ascends a mountain and he sits down. He sits maybe because he's going to talk for 3 chapters, 110 verses. I don't know. Sometimes a lot is made about the fact that he sits. I think he just sits because he knows it's going to be a little bit of a lengthy message, unlike today's. Just I'll let you know that. And then his disciples come and they sit near him. And the first verse of Matthew chapter 5 tells us that this sermon is not delivered to outsiders. It's delivered to 4 disciples. I say 4 disciples because at this point in Matthew, that's the only ones we've met. Peter, Andrew, James, and John have left their homes, their families, in order to follow Jesus. Now, later on in Matthew chapter 10, we meet at least 12 disciples. But to this point, Jesus has only called 4. But Matthew doesn't name the disciples who are there with Jesus on the mountain. And so any of us can find ourselves in that group, sitting close and listening to Jesus' words. But we as the disciples are not the only ones listening, because as Matthew notes, Jesus sees the crowds, and he likely knows that they will be eavesdropping. And the crowd needs to hear the message as well, so that they don't misunderstand Jesus. They have been following Jesus for a chapter, as we might say, because as Matthew tells us, Jesus' fame has spread all over Syria. But they're following him not because of his teachings, but because of his healthcare plan. The crowds are coming with the afflicted, with the possessed, with the disabled, and they're seeking a cure. For the gospel writers, Jesus gives sight to the blind and the ability to walk to those who cannot. But his primary role is not that of a healer. His primary role is not that of a miracle worker or an exorcist. For the Gospels, more important than Jesus' miracles are Jesus' death and resurrection and his teachings. A healing is good news for the individual that is healed. But even those who are not in need of healing can find them in need of physical healing, can find themselves in the beatitude. Because we may all find ourselves mourning, or meek, or poor in spirit, or peacemaking. So Jesus begins the series of 9 statements that are traditionally called the Beatitudes. A lot of ink has been spilled on that word. The word itself comes from Jerome's 4th century translation of the Bible into Latin. He uses the words beati. And some say, well, what's behind Jesus' word, bless? Well, in the Greek translations of the New Testament, it's this word. But they say, Jesus never spoke Greek. That's right. Well, what's the Hebrew term? Well, the Hebrew term used in the Old Testament is this word. But Jesus probably didn't speak Hebrew either. He probably spoke Aramaic. Oh, well. And they go on and on. But you know what I've noticed in all that discussion, reading through all the pages of the different writers, is they all come back and they say, you know what? Blessing or blessed is probably the best word we have. A beatitude is a blessing, and blessings come with responsibilities. The Beatitudes are very familiar to a lot of people in our culture, even people who've not heard them. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And so our challenge is to get past the familiarity and consider, what does blessed mean? Who are the poor in spirit? What would meek have meant to Jesus' first audience? And how do these Beatitudes still speak to us in the 21st century? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, one of the popular views of the meaning of that phrase, poor in spirit, means that these are people who are weak in faith. But I'm not sure that's what Matthew's phrase really means. And it also doesn't mean that the poor in spirit are people who are not conceited. The poor in spirit are people who are not full of pride. And the qualifier in this beatitude is important. Jesus isn't talking about people who are, what we might say, economically poor. Jesus is talking about people who are poor in spirit. Now, insight into what that phrase might mean actually takes us back to the Dead Sea Scrolls and one of the manuscripts that was discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there, in one of those manuscripts, this phrase, poor in spirit, is put beside the phrase, righteous of God. And that suggests that the poor in spirit are people who focus not on themselves, but focus on God, but also focus on others. And they're not caught up in self-centered concerns. Those are who the poor in spirit are. And so the poor in spirit is more than just economics. It's because being poor economically doesn't make you any more righteous than not being poor. In the same way, being wealthy doesn't make you any more righteous than if you were poor. So the poor in spirit is a synonym for people who have enough humility so that they're not operating from a sense of pride. To be poor in spirit is to recognize that you are the beneficiary of what others have done, the help of others. You are also the beneficiary of a system. And part of what it means to be poor in spirit is to recognize that, but it's also then to pay it forward to those whom we can. Poor in spirit are people who don't sit around saying, well, look at what I've accomplished. Or worse, people who feel resentful because they haven't received what they think that they should have received. They haven't received maybe sufficient honor or recognition for what they've done. People who are poor in spirit know that they did the right thing. And they know that God knows. And that is sufficient recognition for them. The poor in spirit are those who recognize the gap between what they have and what they should have. We may have a bank account, but we may not have compassion, generosity, or love. We may have a comfortable home, good health care, a vehicle that runs well. But we may also have neighbors who struggle with paying the bills, who struggle with putting food on the table or getting to work. The poor in spirit are those who see what a lot of other people don't see, that they're blessed. And because they are blessed, they have this vision. They see what others don't see. And what they see compels them to act. The poor in spirit are those who are aware of their own blessings, their own privilege. And because they are aware of that, they work to help others who don't have those same benefits. We may have the privilege of attending schools with up-to-date materials and great motivated teachers. But we see that others lack those resources. Overseas, in our own country, even in our own province. And the poor in spirit are motivated to help those who lack those kind of resources. We may be blessed because of the social status of our families, even of our appearance, or the people we know, our contacts, our networking. And we're blessed when we recognize that. But we're also blessed when we recognize that, you know what? It's not anything that I've done. It's not my own drive. All that I have, I did not achieve all of that on my own. Some of it's due to the family I grew up in, to my contacts, to my luck maybe, even maybe to my appearance. Over and over again in this, where that one came from, sorry. Over and over again, let's go there. Back to talking about appearance. This is all you got. Over and over again, we hear in this sermon, Jesus saying, blessed. I know we read it blessed, but blessed. If you had a chance this past week to do your homework and read through the Sermon on the Mount several times, you kept hearing that word at the beginning. What a great opening to a message. Blessed. Blessed. And when we hear that we're blessed, we should also hear a sense of responsibility. We've been blessed. We've been given a blessing, maybe a talent. And a blessing or a talent or a skill, if it's unappreciated, if it's unused, it's wasted. And we are blessed to be a blessing. What Jesus is doing in the Sermon on the Mount is launching the creation of a new movement with his disciples. And it's not a movement that's a political movement. It's not a civic movement that maybe we're familiar with. What Jesus is doing is setting up a new family, a new community. And he will talk about that later in Matthew. Not everyone who calls you who follow me, you who do my will, God's will, are my brothers and my sisters. The Sermon on the Mount answers the question, well, how do you live as part of that family? How do you live as part of that new community that Jesus is calling us to? What would it look like to live in this new family where people actually do what the Sermon on the Mount thinks that people should do? What would that be like? What would it look like to live in this new community where people actually are what the sermon thinks people should be? In that new family, in that new community, God's will can be done on earth as it is in heaven. And anyone can be part of that community. So when Jesus begins his sermon, that is not a sermon, he tells his disciples, blessed. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Last week, I said that one of the things the Sermon on the Mount is doing, maybe one of the most important things, because it's a beginner's guide to living in the kingdom of heaven. It's showing us, it's setting forth how we can have one foot here in this world, on this earth, and one foot in the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is," notice present tense, "is," here, now, the kingdom of heaven. The poor in spirit don't have to wait until reaching the pearly gates. You already have one foot in that heavenly kingdom today, right now. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.